Hello and welcome to Legal Thinking with me, Liam Pape, and as ever, my esteemed colleague, Ed Wootton.
That's right. In this week's episode, we are handing over to Ali Cloak, who's a partner in our Inquest and Fatal claims team, as she speaks to two members of Inquest, a charity and human rights campaigning organisation that are currently fighting for No More Deaths campaign, which is basically calling for a national oversight mechanism to ensure that lessons are learned from inquests. She spoke to Deborah Coles, who is the executive director of Inquest, as well as Aniesha Obuobie, who basically leads on the work they've done in relation to Grenfell and that inquiry.
And it's also worth saying that this interview has been recorded with video, unlike our usual episodes. So if you'd like to watch the podcast as well as listen to it, you can go to our YouTube channel, which is, if you search RWK Goodman on YouTube, you shall find it. So without any further ado, let's roll tape.
Can we start with you just telling us a little bit about Inquest and the work that you do?
Yes, so for over 40 years now, Inquest has worked alongside bereaved people following state-related deaths. So by that we mean deaths in police, prison custody, immigration detention, mental health settings, learning disability settings, and other deaths that raise questions about state or corporate accountability. Working alongside families to help them access legal representation at the inquests, and then use the evidence that comes out of the legal processes to try and effect meaningful change and to stop deaths happening again.
Inquests serve an important public function. You've just touched on it there. In identifying how deaths occur, and coroners are also obliged to prepare a Prevention of Future Deaths report, known as a PFD report, when they become aware of circumstances that mean there's a risk that future deaths will occur. On paper, that sounds really reassuring, but in my experience, the reality is pretty different to that. And I'm interested in your views really on the current system of PFD reporting and what the pros and cons are of that.
One of the really welcome things that the Coroners and Justice Act brought into force was making it mandatory for coroners to report any matters of concern. So what Inquest and lawyers, I think, try and do is to maximise the preventative potential of inquests, because what we know from the families that we work with is that they want the truth. They want an acknowledgement of failings and those responsible held to account. But more than anything, they want to try and stop another family going through the process. And so a prevention of death report can play a really significant role in safeguarding lives in the future. So it has a really life-changing potential if properly utilised. And that's where Inquest have identified a real accountability gap in the fact that until very recently, there was not even a website where you could find PFD reports. Now there is a judiciary website that makes those reports available. But what we've noted, and also the work of Georgia Richards and her preventative tracker has highlighted, is that sometimes organisations to whom these reports are made don't even respond. There's no opportunity to chase up those who don't respond. And the responses that public authorities often give are really cut and paste, limited in detail, or they just simply repeat and rehash the very policies that have often led to the death in the first place. So the opportunity to actually find out what has happened on the ground, how these PFD reports have impacted on policy and practice, is extremely difficult.
Yeah, that definitely rings true with sort of my experience. And getting a PFD report at the end of an inquest, and the family taking some comfort from that initially, and then receiving a really superficial, flimsy response that literally in some cases a rehashing of evidence that they'd already said in the inquest, which was obviously not acceptable because it still went on to lead to the report, and there being no real teeth
Absolutely.
to actually enforce.
And I think our frustration, and because we're an organisation that has got a lot of knowledge and expertise going back decades, is the frustration of seeing the same issues being repeated time and time again. So we have this body of PFD reports effectively saying the same things. We have public authorities saying those very hollow words to families that lessons will be learned. And we simply don't see the change on the ground, which is really the motivation for us setting up the campaign around the National Oversight Mechanism.
And what central arrangements are there in place at the moment for these reports to be reviewed? Are you sort of aware of any organisations that do undertake this analysis themselves, for example, any prisons or sort of advisory groups that sort of do these thematic reviews themselves to try and learn from them?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that in the research that we have done around PFDs and any work that people have done, it's quite often ad hoc, piecemeal. There is definitely no central oversight of the PFD reports, their follow-up. There's no thematic analysis. I mean, interestingly, before the Coroners and Justice Act came into force, the Ministry of Justice would produce something called the Rule 43 Bulletin, and that the Rule 43s were PFDs previously, known as Rule 43 reports. They would produce a Rule 43 bulletin, which, although limited, was at least something in bringing together some of the thematic areas that these reports covered. But at the moment, there is nothing other than the judiciary website or the work that Inquest does around specific areas. So, for example, we've produced reports drawing out the themes from PFDs into deaths in prison, into mental health, into policing. Most recently, the Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody did a quite detailed piece of work on prevention of future death reports, and I was part of that body. And I think they, having interviewed coroners, having interviewed people within the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office, the Department of Health, were told that these reports were looked at, but certainly there is no independent body that is systematically collating, analysing and tracking what action has actually been taken. And Aniesha can speak to some of the areas where we've seen repeated reports and seemingly no action following.
Yeah, that would be great. Aniesha, if you've got some examples you can take us through.
Yeah, so recently we made a submission to the Justice Committee on their follow-up inquiry into the Coroner Service, and two of the examples that we gave of casework that we've seen trends in this on this issue was epilepsy deaths in prison. And in recent years, we've seen 18 prison deaths that have been epilepsy related. And one of the repeated issues was surrounding cell sharing risk assessments, and the fact that if someone has epilepsy and they're going into prison, they should be sharing a cell. And now where we've seen a few cases where those risk assessments were not completed properly, and that led to people being put in cells by themselves. And when they had issues related to epilepsy, there wasn't someone to kind of monitor or to oversee that. and unfortunately they died. We have seen a trend of PFDs where this has been mentioned or other similar issues have been mentioned, and yet the same death happens again. And to add on to what Deborah said earlier about how our work tracks that, and we've also been told a lot by bereaved families that it's re-traumatizing for them to go through the inquest process, come out with a PFD report, struggle to get a response from the public body or the authority, and then to hear of another death in the same circumstances, often in the same prison. And so that affects not only the family who've lost someone again, but the family that went through that process in the first place, knowing that no changes have been put in place and that this is going to happen to other families. And another example we had was of two housing cases. One was in 2011 and one was in 2022, and they were both under Leeds City Council. It was two tower blocks where two young children died by falling out of the windows. And in the first inquest in 2011, the coroner made really strong recommendations about fitting locks on windows and having people assess flats where there was a high risk of a child being able to fall out of a window. And those recommendations were given. And 11 years later, unfortunately, there was another death in really similar circumstances in a neighbouring tower block. So one of the issues we have and that led to our campaign is that the recommendations are actually being made quite often. And if they were implemented, we know that lives would be saved, but they're not implemented. And there's a struggle to even get a response or a reason why they haven't been.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking to see these, avoidable deaths being repeated where they could easily be avoided. What do you think the sort of reasons are as to why perhaps some providers aren't responding to PFDs in the first place, and then also why the ones that do come back with recommendations are then not seeing them through? What are the main barriers, do you think?
I mean, I can answer in relation to Grenfell. I mean, I think it's quite hard for us to understand what some of the barriers are. So Grenfell was quite a public example. During the inquiry, there was a lot of evidence about the Lakanal House fire, which had happened in 2009 and 6 people had died. And again, there was a Rule 43 report where the coroner made really clear and strong recommendations. And had those been implemented, it's likely that Grenfell wouldn't have happened. And now we're seeing the government still not implementing really key recommendations around personal emergency evacuation plans. And if they were to be implemented, we know that would save a lot of lives if there were to be another fire and to reduce the risk of disabled residents not being able to evacuate. The government have come back and have had a consultation and have proposed a different procedure that they would implement, which is lesser and doesn't protect people in the same way. But their response has been around resources and proportionality. So that's the kind of things that we hear and are told. But I think from our perspective and from the perspective of people who've lived through that experience and also bereaved families, we've already seen the worst case scenario where lives are lost. And that's happened twice now in that specific example. And we've also seen other house fires that have had the same cladding issues or evacuation issues. And so actually to implement them would not only save lives, but it would be a better use of resources. And I just think it's not clear why some of these things aren't implemented. And actually not only the cost of lives, but the cost of going through these processes again. Like, for example, the Grenfell Tower inquiry has cost millions and millions of pounds. And that's a process that could be avoided if the new recommendations that have been made are implemented.
I just got something, Ali, to add to that, because I think what we saw during the Grenfell inquiry was the utter contempt that was shown towards the coroner's recommendation. And I think there is something about the lack of value that some of the organisations play towards the inquest system. And, as we know, there are still many problems with the inquest system, but where you have a properly conducted inquest where a family are legally represented, where you have a coroner who really is trying to maximise the preventative potential of the coroner's inquest, and then see organisations either fail to respond or to respond with, just repeating, as I said before, repeating the policies that have actually resulted in the death in the first place, I think shows the lack of proper attention that's given to the coronial system. I also think there is a problem with the fact that sometimes there are serious delays from the inquest and the death itself, and you see organisations very often more concerned about reputational damage management than seeing the inquest as an opportunity to look at what went wrong and what improvements could be made. How can they learn as organisations from the evidence that's come out of that inquest? And then what happens is you see organisations effectively trying to argue against a PFD report on the basis that, oh, well, that was then, and in the interim, we've done all these changes. And certainly we've seen, as part of the research that we did around calling for an independent body, we looked at a lot of the lawyers' websites who represent trusts and represent public bodies, and effectively see them advertising, their firm as a way of avoiding a PFD report. And I think that whole kind of approach, and that quite adversarial approach whereby they will argue against a report that actually not only could have a bearing on local learning, so an individual trust, but also national learning. And so I think some, we have to ask questions about how do those public bodies who instruct lawyers, what is their real objective? Is their real objective reputation management, or is there a real objective learning and the hope that through this process we'll prevent deaths occurring in the future?
I would also,
sorry.
I was just going to say, I would just add really quickly to that there's also no real repercussions if you don't implement something, and the lack of follow-up is another reason why a lot of these things aren't implemented.
Yeah, and of course, a PFD report is only written where the coroner believes there's a current and ongoing risk. So basically, at the end of the hearing, as it usually is, if they've been persuaded, even if it is just with evidence that's been produced in the last week before that hearing, saying that suddenly all these steps have been taken. I've seen it where a coroner is persuaded that they don't need to write a PFD report because they've had this really hefty statement filed with all of these details. And the family are sat there saying, well, hang on, they've had 4 years since the death, or 2 years since the day of the death, and this has only just been produced now. We've got no evidence that these things have been done and are actually in place and are working and are being audited to see that it's actually really embedded. And so, that's another massive hole in the system, in that actually the reports are only written by the people that haven't already tried to fix it, or at least said they'll fix it. And then there's even less accountability for those bodies because there isn't even a PFD report published that sort of highlights the issue in the first place. That's a real frustration with the families I work for, just having this all this evidence dropped at the last minute saying all these things have been done, and it's really clear that's just been for the purpose of the inquest because they've had so long beforehand to have done all these things or to have involved the family, and they haven't.
It also, I think, it goes back to my earlier point. It undermines the preventative potential at a national level if a coroner is persuaded not to write a report about, a particular mental health setting or a prison, when in fact the same systemic failings that resulted in that one death could be happening across other prisons or other mental health settings. And that's certainly something that we see, of course, because the other problem with that is that the only way that you will then really know that changes haven't been made, and as Aniesha has already said, the psychological impact on families of learning about another death happening. There is no body that is actually charged with following up what has actually happened following a death. And in those cases where coroners don't make reports, even if there's a very critical conclusion, inquest conclusion, those aren't centrally collated either. So as you say, you could go through an inquest with all these really serious systemic failings. A body has said, well, actually, we've dealt with all of this. And there's no way of testing that in practice.
I've had some examples where a coroner just by chance has been aware of similar issues with the same provider, and then they've made a much bigger deal out of it and have been much harder to persuade that it's all under control, because it clearly isn't. But that really is by luck, rather than because the system makes that. So.
I think a lot of coroners, I mean, certainly, in our experience of not only, we got overview of so many inquests, but we, of course, speak to coroners. And I know I delivered some training for coroners on PFD reports, in part to try and make them better aware of how important these reports were to families, let alone the public interest. And I think there's a lot of frustration for coroners because they don't have the power or indeed the resources to actually follow up what happens to these reports. And I think we'd probably argue that that's not their role to do so. But there is clearly an accountability gap there, where you have a report, and often, coroners will often write really very meaningful reports and will outline, all the concerns that have come out of the inquest. But as Aniesha said, there are no sanctions for not responding to those reports, and there are no sanctions for doing a cut and paste response, which is something that we see quite a lot in our work. And then, of course, it's very difficult then to test the effectiveness of these reports because there's nobody doing any of that tracking or follow-up. So I think, for families, that the system's failing, but also it's failing the public interest, because at the end of the day, this is about trying to safeguard lives. So, it puts everybody's lives at risk if that learning is not being properly harnessed and acted upon.
Yeah, definitely. And I think earlier you sort of touched on the institutional indifference, if you like, that we sometimes see. And I should say there are some really good examples, and we do have lots of really positive, reassuring experiences where changes, are made from the inquest process, and families do see really solid, robust, positive changes made that will make a massive difference and will stop others going through the same. Mm. But obviously, sort of, naturally, we tend to focus on the others because that's where the campaigning needs to be done. But the institutional indifference is definitely something that does come across. And I think almost the worst offenders, if you like, are the ones that become most immune to further recommendation because they're almost inured to it because it sort of happens fairly regularly. And I suppose where there is a chronic under-resourcing issue or sort of under-capacity issue, I suppose there is a very practical difficulty for some of these bodies in bringing about these changes where there really isn't the money to do it. And it isn't always purely down to money, but that's obviously a big part of it, where it goes to, the numbers of people on the ground or, systems being changed.
But I think, Ali, what you say is really important, that that actually we have, there are examples of where reports have led to meaningful change, which is why it's so important that, that organizations explain. If there isn't the money available to do the change, well, then that should be made very, very clear, because then, if this is an issue of resources, and quite often you'll see in some of the PFD reports, thinking about mental health as an example, quite often you'll see coroners raise concerns about resources, about the fact that, the one of the issues that comes up in our work is, for example, people being sent miles away from home because there isn't the bed capacity in the local area. Well, those are also really important. Those are also really important things to have responses to, because that's then about political will and about where, we spend or where governments put their resources and where do they spend their money. But I think it is important to highlight the fact that, these reports can and do make a difference. I think that, the problem is that in our experience, we see that there are about over 400 of these reports made a year, and just the failure to properly draw together all that, all those thematic areas and do that analysis. I think then the risk is that the reports just really end up on a shelf somewhere. And that's the frustration. I think that's the frustration that lawyers, families, Inquest all share.
Yeah, so Deborah, earlier you touched on Dr. Richard's website, the Preventable Deaths Tracker site, which is the first and only open database of all of the coroner's PFD reports in England and Wales. And although there is a judiciary website where they all get published, it's very rudimentary. And even if you actually know the specific report you're trying to find on it, it's really hard. So the chance of someone pulling together meaningful data of it is really, really low. So the Preventable Deaths Tracker website sort of seeks to cut through that, really. And basically it's really, really impressive website, and you can sort of filter by trends or geographical area or particular coroner and sort of see how many reports are written, whether there's a response, and you can access the copies of those documents. So it's a really impressive tool. But I think the public could probably be pretty surprised that that's had to be done by a small team with no core funding, largely reliant on donations, and that just isn't part and parcel of the system that's already in place sort of centrally. It is a bit baffling, as you said, that all those reports are just effectively just sat there on a shelf, and there is just no actual follow-up other than, the work that's being done by organisations like Inquest and this site. So the Preventable Deaths Tracker website cites that less than 2% of all inquests have a coroner's PFD report written. And so that will be, they say, is less than 1% of all avoidable deaths. So it's clear that better management of PFD reports wouldn't be a total solution, even if that system was working optimally, because it's still only such a small sort of proportion, if you like, of sort of the estimated overall avoidable deaths. And I just wondered what your plans are and what Inquest are calling for in terms of solving the bigger picture.
I mean, I think that the tracker, that George's tracker, it is important for the reasons that you've spelled out, and we see it very much as complementary to what we're calling for, which is a national oversight mechanism to address the accountability gap that we've talked about, and that lack of transparency on the extent to which public bodies and others are actually implementing and acting on recommendations from coroners' inquests. We've also extended it to include reviews and inquiries that follow state-related deaths, because we recognise that, there is that there is that body of learning that comes out of the different systems. So effectively, the proposal that we have is for then a national oversight mechanism that would firstly collate on a publicly available database, probably taking, a lot of the really good work that Georgia's done, to collate all recommendations following post-death processes. And it would then be able to make clear whether an organisation has responded, whether they've accepted any of the recommendations, because even in rejecting a recommendation, actually then if you track that, you then know if another death had happened in a similar circumstance. So I think that's really important. It would then obviously be able to categorize recommendations by types of death, by different demographics and protected characteristics, by detention setting, and then obviously, we think it would be a very important hub for lawyers, for coroners, for public inquiries, researchers, the public more generally. And then what it would do is, building on that information that's collated, it would be able to then do that thematic analysis and then issue reports on emerging themes and patterns, which I think would, in a way, it would then fill that kind of information deficit that we have on what these reports are actually commenting on. And then we'd see that analysis then also feeding into an annual report that would be made to Parliament, so that there was actually more parliamentary scrutiny and buy-in on the importance of the reports and the learning that can be gleaned from them. And then there would be follow-up. And I think that's quite important, because what we have identified, as we've said, is, there is no other independent body doing this. It would actually then be able to escalate issues to parliamentary committees. To this, we envisage using select committees, but also following up specific areas of concern with, for example, the Crown Prosecution Service, the Health and Safety Executive, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, basically trying to ensure that there was much greater learning, prevention, transparency, and then, of course, accountability. Because at the end of the day, this is about trying to safeguard life. And I think we've given evidence on the National Oversight Mechanism to Parliament, to two parliamentary committees, the Justice Committee as well as the Lords Committee. And I think there is a lot of surprise amongst parliamentarians when they find out that actually there is no system for properly monitoring what comes out of these processes. Aniesha, you probably can add some thoughts and examples to here. But I think this mechanism has come about from, I think, from our own frustration over going back many decades, but also from conversations we've had with lawyers, with families, with academics, and indeed with parliamentarians, because the accountability gap that we have is just meaning that there are this whole plethora of inquiries, investigations resulting in very powerful evidence about risks to life, and yet nothing happens.
Yeah, I would add that it is interesting that people are often shocked that it doesn't already exist, and that we're having to campaign for it. And we've had a lot of support even from before we had a proper campaign, just from discussing it, and it's been included in submissions by lawyers at the Grenfell inquiry, and also raised in inquests and other settings as well. But since we launched the campaign last June, we've had a really high number of organisations supporting from a broad remit, who work on different kinds of cases to us, who work on mental health, cladding issues, suicide, prisoners' rights. And I think that is kind of testament to how important it is, because it goes across so many different sectors and affects so many different people. We speak a lot about how families are really supportive of it and actually drive the campaign quite a lot as well themselves. And part of that is because they are so entrenched in the process of the inquest and even the follow-up process, where there is no real follow-up mechanism. We have a lot of families telling us that they are the ones who have to chase for a response, and that just shouldn't be the case at all. It shouldn't be down to families themselves or even organisations like us. It should already be a body that exists, and that this is just a mechanism that works.
What are the key steps or milestones for this to come into being? Like, how does this come about in practical terms?
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, it would require some resources to set up a secretariat to begin to do the work that we've already outlined. And we've been asked a number of questions about, government are pressed for money. But I think, first of all, there's the human cost, which we don't need to overstate really, about the fact that failing to learn from deaths, has an indescribable human impact in terms of families, grieving the loss of a loved one, often in preventable circumstances, who then engage in these protracted, distressing processes in the hope of trying to stop it happening to somebody else. So you have the human side, but then you also have the financial cost, because death, as we know, is expensive. The investigation processes, be that, independent investigations that are carried out, the inquest system, public inquiries, the cost of the public purse is huge. And so the safeguarding of even an individual life would cover the cost of a secretariat to begin this process. So it would need an independent body to be set up. Possibly it would be, the independence is absolutely vital. I think it's important to say that, but it would be a body that would be accountable to Parliament. So it would be independent of government, potentially sponsored by the Cabinet Office, and we see it, very much existing alongside, other oversight bodies, but I think the importance of it is that it would cover a broad range of areas and would, in a sense, work with the various other kind of oversight, inspection and investigation bodies, but be independent of them. And I think the other thing, I mean, we've got various principles that we think that it needs to have, as well as structural and operational independence. It would also be accountable to bereaved families, and we think that there would be a role of an advisory panel made up of bereaved families. It would have an annual report produced. It would be given powers to highlight concerns and follow those up with some of the enforcement organisations. And that there would be a duty for people to actually respond to requests for information, because obviously one of its key roles will be to try and properly scrutinise what has actually happened in response to these. And then it would also be underpinned by standards on combating discrimination and racism, because those trends are also really important for a body like this to keep a kind of oversight of.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So the National Oversight Mechanism is something you're calling for in a sort of as part of your No More Deaths campaign. And I've seen that obviously you're calling for people to sign the petition and to write to their MPs. What else can people do to get behind the campaign?
So those are probably our key asks, and that's what we ask generally everyone to do. But organisations can also formally endorse it and sign up to that, and then generally share our resources, share any updates on the mechanism. We've been speaking about it quite a lot. writing to your MP, but also speaking to your MP in person about it as well?
I think the contact with MPs is really, really important, because what we've noticed in this is that it's often the constituency MPs who have spoken to families who've been through these processes, that are made aware really of these issues, often for the first time. And we know this when we did our campaign for legal aid for inquests to try and address the kind of imbalance and inequality of arms, and we had a success there, particularly around deaths that engage Article 2 of the Human Rights Act, as you'll know, Ali. And a lot of that work was about raising MPs' awareness of the injustices that families experience. And this is a campaign very much motivated by and led by families' desires to see the inquest system working properly. But there is also, that's also a legal requirement. Inquests are set up, and they exist to shine a light, really, particularly where the state has been involved and is supposed to keep somebody safe. And I think a lot of MPs, when they learn about some of the challenges that families experience, that makes them aware of the importance of some of these issues. And I think learning from deaths is an area that has just not been given the proper attention or resource. And I think we're really pleased to see just how this campaign has resonated with so many people. But as Aniesha said, it's often, I think people are often surprised that you have all these legal processes, but nobody has ever thought about the importance of the follow-up and the tracking and the accountability.
And we were describing some of the steps and processes that happen along the way. And when you think of the totality of all of that time and effort and cost, it seems like a really small little extra bit, really, to actually make that more meaningful, and to really, just that extra bit is kind of the most important bit to prevent avoidable deaths. Really frustrating that's not happening. Is it are we out of kilter with other countries in the way that we approach it?
I think, we've done a bit of research. We've looked at various other jurisdictions. And Australia have got a far more advanced, they have an inquest system, and they have a far more advanced structure in terms of following through and making public not only the reports that are made, but what action is taken. And they have interestingly used what they call independent monitors, particularly in response to where there've been multiple deaths. So following some bushfires that they had, they appointed an independent monitor, and their role was to actually go on the ground and see what had actually happened in response to the recommendations made by coroners. And it was interesting because one of the monitors gave evidence to the Lords Committee that was looking at this area. And, he said that nothing beats actually interrogating what they say they're doing and actually going and seeing it firsthand. And I think that, to me, it really echoed a lot of our concern about the way in which, organizations at the last minute produce these sophisticated action plans to say that they're doing all these things. But who is there to actually test that? Who actually can demonstrate that that's being done? So that's quite an interesting model. And certainly that's what we would hope that an independent body would do. It would actually be able to systematically review what organisations are saying in response to these reports.
Is there anything else that you think is helpful to talk through, Deborah or Aniesha?
I think that has covered it. Just that we would ask for people to support the campaign and to keep up to date with the campaign and sign the petition and share it far and wide.
I think we're waiting on the Justice Committee report on their follow-up inquiry to the coroner system, and there are of course other areas of concern with the coronial process, but I think we are really very much hoping that they will endorse the need for, whether they call it the National Oversight Mechanism or not, the need for an independent body to ensure far greater oversight. And I really hope that if we get something like this, then at least families will feel that these processes are more meaningful, and that where those reports are made. And actually, I would hope that it would give coroners the confidence as well to see that in making a report, there is somebody who is going to take this forward, and that coroners' inquests become a more meaningful process for everybody concerned,
and lead to meaningful change and actually preventing future deaths. Because if the reports are being made, it just seems it just doesn't make sense that nothing happens after and that we don't see an end to it.
Yeah, I think, Deborah, you make a good point about coroners perhaps even themselves becoming disenfranchised with it. And you do see in the data for the coroners and how many reports they write, some coroners write an awful lot of PFD reports, some write none. Yeah. And of course, they're responding to what's before them. But in theory, that would be a much more sort of even spread, with everything else being equal. And so, there seem to be some that perhaps take it more seriously and, really see the value in that. And then others who, for various reasons, perhaps don't. And that in itself is quite worrying, that the outcome can vary so much depending on just who's hearing the case.
I mean, I think that, the chief coroner, in holding a specific session on prevention of future death reports and hearing from Inquest and Georgia in terms of the preventative tracker, I hope that that's almost kind of sent a message to coroners that, this is an important function that they can play, that is in the interest not just of the family whose inquest they've presided over, but the public interest. And that hopefully with greater transparency of what happens to the reports, an independent body in our view would be extremely helpful for coroners and will assist them in their work.
Yeah, and in the long term, maybe reduce their workload.
Well, yeah, that's the ideal. Yeah.
So thank you to Ali, Deborah, and Aniesha there for their insights into the challenges of ensuring lessons are learned from inquests. If you want to find out more about what RWK Goodman does in relation to ensuring lessons are learned after a death, you can go to our website, and we'll put a link in the show notes for you.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Legal Thinking, do make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you get podcasts. But for the time being, that's all from us. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening.